this webinar series. Welcome to the webinar series. Uh, the main part of this webinar is to gain um, more industry uh, consensus and involvement in this project that we've been working on for a few years. So we're going to talk. I'll talk for just a few minutes about my motivation for being in this JIP, and then I'm going to turn it over to Shankar in a little bit to get into some of the details here. But I've been working in internal corrosion um, for 25 years. I've been working in the industry for 37, I think, already, but I was mostly external corrosion for the first 15 years of my career. And when I started doing internal corrosion, um, the corrosion inhibitors were really kind of a dark science, and I would receive information from my chemical vendors who I highly respect. But a lot of times the well-meaning testing that they were doing was not something that would translate very readily to my own environment. And I thought that it wasn't, we, as an industry, we could do a little bit better in determining the efficacy and other factors, other parameters of performance chemistries like corrosion inhibitors. So we Shankara reached out to me about 4 or 5 years ago, and he had this project because Shankara's been quite involved in ASTM for his whole career, and he felt that there was a need to have more ASTM level tests, like specifically tests that have repeatability and precision statements, tests that you can rely upon to be accurate. And my goal was to also make sure those test methods are suitable to represent what's happening in a pipeline, because some of the work that I had done, um, I could see that chemistry that worked really well in a laboratory where you had, you know, the perfect ability for the corrosion inhibitor to get into the water phase, for instance, um, uh, would perform well in a test, but that wouldn't necessarily translate to performance in the field. So we ended up breaking up the project. Instead of just going into doing, repeatability and precision work on corrosion inhibitors, we decided to crowdsource a little bit and find out what people were doing. So we engaged in the first phase of the JIP, a bunch of people that were stakeholders in the corrosion industry, mostly operators, some chemical vendors, some laboratories, to talk about uh, specifically where we're using corrosion inhibitors and what kind of tests we might be relying on. And that was to see what we realized is that it's actually quite a bit different depending on where you are in the hydrocarbon chain. If you're working downhole, your interests and your test would be a lot different than if you're on a refined product pipelines or a gas pipeline, for instance. So we ended up identifying, I think, 20, well, more than 20, 25 different environments. I can't remember the number anymore, but a large number of different environments. And we extended even to things like CO2 pipelines. We kind of crowdsourced where people were using inhibitors and then kind of a rough hand wavy what sort of tests they were using. Phase two, we drilled down more into how people were adapting tests, because it seemed like rarely did people use a test right out of the toolbox. They would modify it a little bit. And so we wanted to see what people were modifying. And then in phase three, we summarized all this information. We came up with some recommended, that these are the sort of the key tests that you would use in different environments, which is all well and good. We now have tests that what we know we're interested in using and developing. And so what we're trying to do in this phase three is now take these test methods which companies are most relying upon and develop some of this repeatability um, data. So this is really the key, is to try and develop better standardization around test methods. This will help us choose better chemistries. It'll help chemical developers develop better chemistries, and it'll help that we're measuring things using the same ruler, if you will. Um, I think there's a lot of good that's coming out of this project. And so this webinar series is to just socialize the stuff that we're doing. Hopefully, some of you will be interested in joining the phase 3 of our project because when you're doing repeatability work in the laboratories, it can get expensive to do good work, and many hands make light work. And if we get a lot of different pocketbooks, it can be cheaper as well individually, and the whole industry benefits. So I think I covered this slide. Next one, Shankara. So, as I mentioned, when I came into the industry, the internal corrosion world, we didn't have awesome things and awesome test methods that we could rely upon. And Shankara did a great job summarizing here that you know, corrosion inhibitors and internal corrosion is kind of the problem child here in the corrosion prevention world and integrity world. You can see that for materials, we've got requirements embedded in regulations. We've got standard test methods that exist. We've got training programs that exist. And then we've got quantitative criteria for whether or not your materials are going to be good in that environment. Similarly for coatings, we have requirements and specs. We've got standard test methods. We've got training programs, and we've got quantitative criteria for whether or not the materials will perform well in your environment. Same thing for cathodic protection. Standards exist, training exists, we got quantitative evaluations. And then when we get to corrosion inhibitors, it's like Wild West. Um, we don't have requirements for corrosion inhibitors or specifically requirements for inhibitor performance in regulations. We only have one ASTM level test method that exists. So it's one test method that was able to meet the rigors of being repeatable and reproducible, what we're now calling precision. And while there's a ASTM corrosion inhibitors course, I don't know too many people that have actually taken it. So the final box there is the criteria for evaluating inhibitor performance, and the performance of the strategy is purely qualitative. So this is the gap that we're hoping to address with this work. Next slide. So, I'm going to hand this over to Shankara, I think, because this is really the stuff that he did the research on, and he'll be able to talk to it probably better than I can. Is that okay with you, Shankara?
Thanks, Trevor. I think you gave a good lead. Once again, thank you all very much and Happy New Year. As Trevor pointed out, we need to do a little more better job in quantitatively evaluate the corrosion inhibitors. And we believe that with this JAP, we are in the pivotal moment to make those changes. That is the premises with which we are running this webinar series, as well as running the JAP. With that background, in this webinar, we would like to address specifically two terms: efficacy and efficiency, obviously in terms of corrosion inhibitor performance. So let us say what is the dictionary definition of efficacy. It is the ability or power of something to produce an intended or desired result. In terms of corrosion inhibitors, it is the ability of the inhibitors to control internal corrosion, in our case, in the oil and gas infrastructures, to an acceptably low level. We don't have the concept of prevention, we have the concept of control. Control the corrosion rate to a manageable low level. That is why we use corrosion inhibitors. That is how corrosion inhibitors program work. To define efficacy, we need to take care of 4 different interdependent parameters as we define in our JAP as T's: transportability, efficiency, availability, and secondary inhibitor properties. if we say that we have a good corrosion inhibitor program, that means that we are addressing all these four parameters, of which one of the parameters is efficiency. This is a classical definition of efficiency. ASTM G184 discusses efficiency is simply the corrosion rate in the absence of corrosion inhibitor and in the presence of corrosion inhibitor in terms of percentage. This definition has been there for more than 80 years, ever since we start using corrosion inhibitors. Many times we focus on efficiency, but not on the efficacy. In our JIP, we address all four of them, but in phase 3, we focus on efficiency only. And we will explain as to why we do so. I think most of us know Dr. David Silverman. He had been in the industry for almost 40 years. He's no more now, but in 2004, he wrote an article to the Corrosion Journal, an editorial article. And Dave was at that time one of the associated editor of the Corrosion Journal. And he pointed out two aspects with respect to corrosion inhibitors. The title itself says a perspective on generating and handling corrosion inhibitor related data. And we would like to bring two aspects of it. Again, this is directly from Dave's paper. In scenario 1, a laboratory reported a corrosion rate in the absence of corrosion inhibitor to be 100 mpy, and in the presence of corrosion inhibitor, anywhere between 5 to 10 mpy. This is the data, but what they report is efficiency, inhibitor efficiency 90 to 95%. In scenario 2, the laboratory reported 1000 mpy of corrosion rate. That is 1 inch per year of corrosion rate in the absence of corrosion inhibitor. And in the presence of corrosion inhibitor, it reduces to 50 to 100 mpy. Again, they report the efficiency as 90 to 95%. Reporting 100 mpy, it makes sense. Reporting 1000 mpy, the data should be costed. Is it practical? Did they do the conversion properly? Did they do the test properly? Did they actually measure corrosion rate? These are the questions that Dave brought out almost 25 years ago. And this was a well-referenced article. In fact, he even questioned what is the value of accepting papers in Corrosion Journal that report unrealistic corrosion rate, such as 1000 mpy. So the whole concept of our JAP and this webinar series is to ensure that whatever data we publish or we report make sense practically. That is one of the major motivations for this webinar series as well as for the JAP. Again, as explained before, efficiency is one component of the efficacy. Of course, we need to address transportability, availability, and secondary inhibitor properties, of which efficiency is one of the parameters that needs to be addressed quantitatively. Again, as Trevor pointed out, when he started the JIP, we went through the oil and gas industry operational conditions. In terms of inhibitors usage, we can broadly classify our operating conditions into 23 categories. Some of them are traditional, for example, downhole tubular and production. Some of them are new, for example, CO2 injection, hydrogen hydrocarbon pipelines, biofuels. And each one of these applications are different from the perspective of corrosion inhibitors. So before we select or before we test corrosion inhibitors, we have to do two important steps. In fact, we would like to thank Trevor because when he started the JIP, he brought this aspect first. Don't go to the lab straight away to do the test and select an inhibitor, but do two important pre-steps. One of the steps became phase one. That step is to establish a template to collect data on efficacy. If we do not know why and under what conditions we are going to apply inhibitors in the field, then there is no point of evaluating corrosion inhibitors in the laboratory. First, understand the operating conditions. What are the chemical programs that are being used? How are you going to make laboratory and field correlation? What are the important secondary inhibitor properties? And then do the lab testing. If you do not do these four steps, then lab testing will not be relevant to the field operating conditions. And of course, after you select a test, you have to make sure that the inhibitor is available in the field. So one thing we did in phase one was to establish a template with which we conducted 226 interviews. Of course, many of you participated, and this template is available for anybody to use. So the first step is to establish the data that we need to evaluate corrosion inhibitors. And then, based on the information, we have to develop a guideline report with which we are going to implement the corrosion inhibitor program. Again, in JIP phase 2, we wrote a report for each one of the 23 applications. And the report is very detailed. It goes through all aspects of efficacy, including efficiency. Again, as Trevor pointed out, we have 23 reports covering each one of the applications. Again, the key message here is that whether you're joining the JIP or not, if you're developing or implementing a corrosion inhibitor program, have a clear document, guideline as to what are the activities you are going to carry out. So develop the guideline report. And then you do the lab testing. If you do the lab testing, as David Suleiman wrote, understand the validity of the data, validity of the laboratory data to the field applications. Otherwise, there is no point of doing lab experiments. So why do we do a lab test? Obviously, the test can be repeated reliably. We can vary the test conditions of the field in a controlled and systematic manner. We can understand the influence of each individual parameters so that we can tailor the corrosion inhibitors accordingly. The premises is that an inhibitor that performs well in the laboratory is likely to perform well in the field, but with two conditions. One, the laboratory methodology should be relevant and representative of field conditions. For example, for oil transmission pipelines, certain parameters that are required are not normally carried out in the laboratory. So we have to establish relevant methodologies with which we can evaluate corrosion inhibitors, for example, for oil transmission pipelines. So the relevancy is very, very important. Only if the laboratory methodology is relevant, it can accurately predict how the inhibitor will perform in the field. So accuracy is one component. Second is precision. If I do the test today, if I get a data, if I do the same test tomorrow, if I get a different data, then that methodology is not precise. That is where ASTM standard test methods play a vital role because they establish precision of laboratory methodologies. One of the objectives of the phase 3, or the main objective of the phase 3, is to establish precision of laboratory methodologies that can be used to evaluate corrosion inhibitors. So laboratory testing and understanding efficiency is important, but more important is also understand the efficacy as to how the corrosion inhibitor program will work. Again, efficiency is a small part of efficacy, but if we don't quantitatively establish efficiency, you cannot establish efficacy. That is the premises of this webinar. With that, let me go through the phase 3 in detail. In phase 3, we are going to focus on development of standard test methods with known precision. Precision can be in terms of repeatability or reproducibility. Repeatability, one person, one laboratory repeated test. Reproducibility is multiple laboratories producing results using the same methodology, following same procedures. As Trevor explained, this JIP has got 3 phases. In phase 1, we established the template and collected and summarized the data on the best practices from owner-operators and chemical developers. This was done in 2023 and 24. We did 226 interviews. The template we used is available for anybody to use it. Of course, the data is not available for non-sponsors. So in phase 2, based on the data we collected, we developed the guideline document. We have got 23 guideline documents covering each one of the applications. This was done last year. Phase 3, actually it was started on December 2nd, 2025. We will focus on development of standard test methods for the most promising and popular methods that were identified in phase 2. And we identified eight laboratory methodologies. The focus of phase 3 is to establish precision based on repeatability, that is based on one laboratory. Of course, we would like to thank all the sponsors who have been supporting this JIP for the last 3 years. And again, I'd like to thank Trevor for his leadership because he really brought this JIP to a kind of focused project. In addition, we also recently got government funding from Government of Canada to support this JIP. So we are in good shape to carry out the phase 3. In phase 3, we have identified 8 methodologies that will be standardized, of which the first 4 methodologies, we have some kind of apparatus commercially available, but they are not standardized. Some form of methodology is available, for example, rotating cage, rotating cylinder electrode, bubble test, and the benchtop rotating impeller test. So the first phase of phase 3 is to establish standards on these 4 methodologies. And the last 4, there is a little bit of development that will be done as a part of the JIP and then standardized. Those 4 methodologies are inverted rotating disc electrode. This was identified to evaluate partition coefficient of corrosion inhibitors, especially for the oil-rich environments. Basically, this test will evaluate whether the inhibitor that was injected in the oil phase can reach the water phase in which corrosion occurs. In the industry, we use a film thickness value that was established in 1940s and 50s. This was a work that was done almost 60 years ago, but we do not have a quantitative method by which we can evaluate the film thickness, for which we identified electrochemical quartz crystal microbalance. Some preliminary work has been done, but we'll be standardizing as to how the EQCM can be used to determine film thickness. We can also use the same EQCM to determine the film persistency. Film persistency may be important or will be important or is important for batch inhibition, for batch inhibitors. Even though we recognize under-deposit corrosion to be an important factor, we do not have a standardized procedure to evaluate the efficiency of corrosion inhibitor to control under-deposit corrosion, for which we identified the BICEL. We'll be developing and standardizing it. Top-of-the-line corrosion has become important failure issue mechanism in some parts of the world, especially in the wet gas transmission pipelines. And we believe that one of the methodologies, EQCM or modified bubble test, can be used to evaluate corrosion inhibitors, the efficiency of corrosion inhibitors for the top-of-the-line corrosion. So in total, we'll be standardizing 8 methodologies in phase 3. So what are the deliverables? We will have step-by-step procedures to carry out tests for all 8 methodologies that will be standardized in phase 3. For all methodologies that will be developed, we will also develop the blueprint. And this blueprint will enable sponsors to manufacture their own apparatus. When we did the interviews, it came very clear that if we want to standardize a laboratory methodology, we need to also standardize the standard solutions. If we do not prepare the solutions, when we say solutions, it also includes saturation of the solution with gases. If we do not have a set procedure, then that can lead to variations in the test result. So one of the side benefits or side outcome of this JP would be to establish a standard on solution preparations. The key output or deliverable of the phase 3 is the repeatability of the laboratory methodologies that will be standardized in phase 3. That is, we will establish precision based on repeatability, that is based on one laboratory. ASTM can publish standard test method based on repeatability, based on one lab data, provided the reproducibility, that is laboratory data from 6 laboratories are available within 5 years after the publications. So we believe that ASTM will publish the standard test method based on the repeatability statement that would come out of the phase 3. And we will coordinate with ASTM or other associations to develop precision statements based on reproducibility. And the sponsors and the proponent will be active in coordinating the inter-laboratory studies that will be carried out after the phase 3 of the JAP. So that is the main deliverable of the phase 3. And this is webinar number 6. And based on the feedback from the last 5 webinars, some of you have requested that we answer certain specific questions, and that's what we are going to address in this webinar. One company indicated that they are interested in joining the JIP. There is no question about it. But the question is, what are the benefits and how can they participate in a way that ensures maximum benefit? And they also suggested, few others also suggested that to help decision making, address some of the logistical considerations, clearly explain what is expected from the sponsors, what is not expected from the sponsors. And one potential sponsor clearly requested that explain the fee structure of the JAP so that there is no confusion about it. And that's what we are going to cover in the rest of this webinar. For the current sponsors, that is those sponsors who have been supporting the JAP from phase 1 and 2, they need to pay only 20K for the phase 3. And they continue to participate. In fact, we have one meeting. We conducted one meeting. There's another meeting coming up. We have a monthly review meetings ongoing. And they participate in those review meetings. For any sponsors, there is, for this kind of, for current sponsors, there is no commitment to carry out any laboratory testing. That will be done in phase 3. All lab tests will be performed by core magnet to establish precision based on repeatability. So there is no confusion about who the current sponsors are. They have been supporting the sponsors from the beginning. New sponsors, if they want to join all 3 phases, this is a fee structure. They will receive all reports, presentations, findings from phase 1 and 2 once the paperwork has been completed. Of course, they will participate in phase 3 meetings once the paperwork has been completed. And all the information obviously will be shared with them. In this category of sponsors, they don't have to do any lab testing. Again, all lab testing will be performed by Corrosion Consulting Inc. to establish repeatability. For those companies, especially oil and gas company owners, operators, and chemical suppliers who wish to join only for phase 3, this is a fee structure. But for this category of sponsors, we will not share any information from phase 1 and 2. Of course, they can participate in phase 3 meetings after the paperwork has been completed. All phase 3 information will be shared with them. Again, this category of sponsors do not have to commit to carry out any laboratory testing in phase 3. The last category, this is where many of the questions came. This category is only open for third-party laboratories who are no way associated with any of the oil and gas companies or chemical suppliers. They are standalone third-party laboratories. They focus only on inhibited testing. This is a fee structure for them, but there is a leniency for them. This category of sponsors will receive all reports, presentations, and findings from phase 1 and 2. After they join, they can obviously participate in phase 3 once the paperwork has been completed. But they have to make a commitment that they would carry out the laboratory testing to establish precision based on reproducibility. That is after the completion of phase 3. All work required for phase 3 will be carried out by core magnet. But after the phase 3 is completed, after the standard test method has been published, When ASTM coordinate inter-laboratory studies to establish reproducibility, these kind of sponsors, this category of sponsors should commit that they will contribute to those inter-laboratory studies. If they commit to that one, then they will get phase 1 and phase 2 reports. That is one thing we would like to confirm. The second thing, there was one chemical supplier, and they asked this question. Hey, we would like to join the JIP, but can you test our chemicals as a part of your JIP? The answer is no. The focus of the JIP is methodology development and standardization. Testing, commercial testing of corrosion inhibitors is not within the scope of the JIP. Of course, for certain laboratory testing, we need one chemical. So we will select one model chemical that will be agreed upon by the sponsors. And we will establish the laboratory methodologies based on the one chemical. That is only to evaluate the methodology and to standardize it, not to test the corrosion inhibitor, but to test the laboratory methodology. So no commercial evaluation of chemicals will be carried out as a part of this JAP. There was also some questions about the blueprints. Again, first things first, the blueprints will be made available to the sponsors to manufacture their own apparatus, which they can use it for their purpose. There is no need for them to do the testing for the JAP. Why do we develop blueprints? The blueprints are drawings that are required to commercially manufacture equipment. Normally, the blueprints will be marked as ready to fabricate. Without blueprints, commercial manufacturer will not fabricate anything because of the liability issues. So the blueprints will contain all information necessary for any qualified manufacturer to build the equipment. And of course, the blueprints will remain confidential to the sponsors for 5 years after the JAP has been completed. In other words, the blueprints will be available for non-sponsors only after about 2032, once the sponsors agree to that agreement. The last question that was asked was, hey, we have the blueprint and we are going to ask a commercial manufacturer to develop the equipment for us. Are you in discussion with any manufacturer so that we can mass produce? Of course, individually we can pay, but at a discounted rate. The answer is yes or no. We are in contact with some companies regarding manufacturing of the equipment that is required for the JAP. As a part of the JAP phase 3, we will develop, fabricate one equipment, one unit of the equipment for the purpose of establishing a test precision in terms of repeatability. So that is our kind of focus now. Of course, we will also tell the manufacturer, hey, there may be some additional companies, they may approach you for manufacturing in the future. But we are not giving any guarantee that the manufacturer on the pricing, or we don't take any responsibility on that regard. Our focus is to develop the blueprint and develop the equipment based on the blueprint and test the equipment whether it can produce repeatable results. And another aspect is not within the scope of the JAP. That's all we have for this webinar, and we'll be happy to take on any questions and clarify any other issues.